Welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mike T. Nelson. On the podcast, we talk about all things to increase performance, add muscle, improve body composition, do all of it in a flexible framework without destroying your health in the process. Today on the program, we've got Simon from iFleet, which does heart rate variability. So we're going to do a deep dive on all things heart rate variability. Simon was one of the first people with an actual app going back, oh man, almost, I think we talked about this, 14 years now that I've been using the app. For listeners who already know, my PhD was on metabolic flexibility and also heart rate variability. So I did a lot of measurements on HRV in the lab, and it was nice to actually have an app to do HRV, which makes it really practical. So we talk all about that, along with some health scare that Simon had and what he's doing now. He has another job and some very cool technology that I think you will enjoy. And if you want to learn more about heart rate variability and other things, you can get onto my daily newsletter. So go to the link down here below. I also do have a course, the heart rate variability education course. We'll put a link to that down below also, that I did in conjunction with iFleet. But you can really use it for any heart rate variability program. I wanted to try to make it so you can understand it. You don't have to know a lot of math. We talk a little bit about math here, but the key was I wanted to create a program that make it understandable and also actionable. Our other sponsor is LMNT. I've been drinking some more LMNT today once again. My favorite today is the raspberry. I usually put about one packet in my little hydro flask here that's 1 liter. It works really well. So you're looking for tasty electrolytes for training and just general life. Check them out. And then also check out my friends at Tecton for ketone esters. I will be in Colorado briefly, doing some work with them. We're filming a bunch of content coming up. And if you're looking for a ketone ester that tastes pretty good, check them out. Most of ketone esters, if you've ever had them, taste pretty darn horrible. And the reason you probably need a ketone ester, you can get some elevation of ketones with the ketone salts, but to get higher elevations of actual ketone bodies, the ketones in your bloodstream that do all the work, you're probably going to need an ester, which is just a different type of chemical structure. Downside is most of those taste really bad. This one tastes good. And you've got 10 grams of ketone esters per can currently. So I'm a scientific advisor to them and an ambassador, so full disclosure on that. But they've got some really, really cool stuff coming out that I can't talk about yet. But as soon as I can, I definitely will share it with all of you here. Go to the link below, use my code to save some dinero, and enjoy this podcast with Simon from iFleet, all about the science, practicality of heart rate variability. Welcome to the podcast. How are you today, Simon?
I'm very good, thank you, Mike. Good to see you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. We haven't chatted in a while. I know you've been busy. Obviously, we still use the iFleet app, and I originally met you online. Man, what was it like? Is it over 11 years ago now? 10 years?
It was actually June 2010 when you got in touch.
Oh, Jesus.
It's coming up for 15 years, man.
That's wild. And that was, I think, right when you had the iFleet app was being developed. Is that correct?
Well, I think the iOS version was available at that time, and I think it was iOS 2.2 or something like that.
Yeah, it was very early.
It was very early. In fact, iFleet was the first heart rate monitor of any kind on the App Store. So to go straight from to go from nothing essentially to measuring heart rate variability using a strap and a little plug-in dongle, which captured the radio waves that all the polar type straps gave out in those days. That preceded Bluetooth, obviously. But Yeah, your first inquiry was relating to whether or not we were going to be able to get the app on Android, which we did manage a couple of years later. It took us a little bit longer, but and we started talking about metrics and HRV and how you could use it in training. And you were kind of wrapping up your PhD at that stage, and
Yeah,
a lot of data and results you were looking at as well. And we brought in a very talented mutual friend, Dr. James Heathers,
that's right.
yeah. He was there. He did some good pioneering testing, in fact, on iThlete in the early days as well by looking at the accuracy of all of the interbeat RR intervals because there were a couple of people around that time who were like really curious about whether or not a consumer product could actually measure HRV accurately, but also with a sort of a healthy scientific skepticism, I think would be fair to say. So James was
Yeah,
one,
because
and Andrew Flatt was
yep,
another one of the pioneers. And
yeah, because at the time I was pretty doubtful because I was measuring it in the lab and we
mm,
had probably 20 grand of used equipment just to measure HRV in the lab. We had to have
mm,
subjects come in. We had to, hook them up to the EKG, and then you had the thing to get the measurements, and then you had to get the RR intervals. You had to pull that off, and I had to write a freaking MATLAB program to convert some of the crap. And you're
mm.
like, yeah, we can do this through your phone. I'm like, what? I don't know. Like, that'd be amazing, but I have my doubts. And I remember talking to Dr. Heathers about it, and he was like, yeah, I looked at it, and it's pretty legit. And I'm like, hmm. And he generally hates everything. So for him to say like it was good, I was like, I'm impressed. I'm interested.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was good. No, I became, I guess I became fascinated by the potential for HRV in, it was probably about 2007, and I dug it out in preparation for today. It was an article in a UK Sports Science Digest called Peak Performance, which was a very good little newsletter, actually. And there
Hmm.
was an article in there by coach and physiologist Eddie Fletcher, who was a physiologist behind some of the tests done in Wattbike. I don't know whether he's still working for
Oh,
the
sure. Yeah, yeah.
but yeah, he was there at the beginning of Wattbike, and he wrote a couple of articles actually about using high-end polar watches to transfer RR intervals to a laptop via an infrared
Yeah.
link. And then once you got the RR intervals into a CSV file, you could download that, then you could upload it into Excel, and you could start to do like you could start to look at trends by using rolling averages, and you could calculate standard deviations and other indications of variance, and that like reduced variability was associated with progressive loading stress of all kinds on the body. And that I found that fascinating from the start, and I thought, well, I'd love to be able to do that for myself, but clearly this methodology is, the novelty of that is going to wear thin fairly quickly. So I started thinking about how you could implement that really quickly. And initially, because I've been employed by Philips for many years in the US as well as the UK, I was thinking about a consumer product to do that. And I was thinking, how on earth, am I going to raise all the money needed to make a consumer product like a watch or something like this, right? And then I was at the dentist and I was explaining to my dentist, who was this big South African guy who was like interested in all matters engineering. He used to
Hmm.
design Porsche turbochargers
Oh,
for
wow.
racing. And I explained to him what I wanted to do. And he said, no, don't do it with don't build a special device. Just make an adapter for these new iPhone things. And I think it was just about on the iPhone 3 at that time. And that's what I decided to do. And I got some help from some friends on writing the software, but it was the kind of help whereby I was basically, yeah, I was learning during that time, and this was the early days of coding for iOS, and it wasn't that difficult really, yeah, to create the first version of the product, and then got a few very helpful people, including yourself, and there was an ex-GB duathlete as well, did some early testing on it, and he happened to be a journalist, so he wrote some articles. And just I look back on it and I think how lucky I was to have, a number of credible people around to give feedback and to test it and to help as well. So that's not forgetting, yeah, some physiologists at the University of Essex, and yeah, a few other people as well, quite a few other people.
Because I think your background at Philips was primarily in DSP, right? Digital signal processing and that type of thing. Because my criticism of people trying to do it was a lot of times it was just the physiologist trying to figure it out. And I'm like,
Mhm.
most physiologists just don't have a background in the things you would need to translate it. Like they could understand the data and they could tell you all about what the data meant, but they weren't the best people to design something to get the data.
Well, that's certainly true. Although a physiologist I've known for a long time, Professor Alison McConnell, who's helped me with some really key insights on how the sort of the respiratory physiology interacts
Mm,
with heart rate and the pressure changes in the chest and all that kind of stuff, which is really fascinating from an evolutionary point of view. But she's actually written a number of LabVIEW programs, but probably
oh,
no
wow.
consumer products. But yeah, so yeah.
And what was the biggest challenge? I mean, my guess in looking at some of the early data would be just getting a clean signal and trying to get the peak of the R wave. So for listeners who are
Mm,
not super familiar, one of the main things you have to do is we have the little QRS, which is the depolarization of electricity across the heart, especially the ventricles, and that
mm,
little top pointy spiky R wave. You're grabbing the peak of that to the next peak, which is how you determine heart rate. But with HRV, you have to be accurate down to like milliseconds. So like super accurate, and you can't interpret like someone moves a strap or you get noise, as one of these intervals. You want to make sure that it's one, accurate to
mm.
where it is, and two, it actually is the heart. It's not some other noise that just got injected into the system.
Yeah. And that certainly is one of the harder aspects of it. And there's a few ways you can tell, and you're absolutely right that, if the mean interval difference is 1 second, so that's 1,000 milliseconds, you certainly want to be able to measure that difference of to the order of like 5 milliseconds,
Sure.
maybe. So that's well under 1%. That's like 0.5% or so. So you certainly do need to be accurate. And you can tell artifacts in a couple of different ways. I mean, and a lot of it requires just knowledge, first of all, of what the spike should look like, whether it's a spike on an ECG or whether it's the spike on a pulse sensor. So later on, when we develop the iFleet finger sensor, you do also get a spike there that looks a little bit like an ECG trace as well. It's got this sort of regular pattern to it, but you need to be able to detect what we call the fiducial point there as well, and that's your sort of your timing reference point. And those are very susceptible to motion artifacts, changes in lighting conditions, all kinds of things like that. But they do have one thing is they have a characteristic shape and amplitude. So you can say, if it's not this shape and it's not within this sort of range of heights that we're expecting, if it's kind of much bigger than that, quite commonly, if it's a noise spike or an artifact, or if one's missing, then you reject that. And when you do HRV analysis, you're often, yeah, I mean, you are dealing with variation, and with RMSSD, which is a commonly used measure, you're dealing with variation from one beat to the next beat. So you've got to make sure that your beats are in order, because if you're skipping one in the middle because you've said that it's an artifact, then you can't compare the two that are either side. They need to be adjacent beats that you're comparing. So you have to make sure that you're rejecting a pair each time something goes wrong. And there's a bit of maths and data cleansing that you have to be involved with there. And another thing is just the plausibility of the change between one pulse and the next. So if somebody's got a mean pulse rate of, make the calculations easy, 60 beats per minute, that means that on average, the beat is going to be 1 second, right? Because that's, 60 beats per minute is one per second. So that's the mean. And you can have a variation there, but it's not going to be half a second. It's going to be at least zero point 0.8 of a second and not more than about 1.2 seconds. So you can look at absolute values, and you can also look at these changes, which are the bits you're trying to characterize, and you can say, well, that really needs to be within this range, and that can be a range that's normally a range which is indexed by the mean heart rate. So long as you can do a reasonable estimate of the mean heart rate, which you pretty much always can, then you can use that in order to calibrate your acceptance criteria for a particular beat in the sequence, and for adjacent beats as well. And those are real challenges that smartwatch manufacturers, and any situation where there's motion going on. So if you're trying to measure HRV during exercise, or when people are moving, or even when they're asleep in bed, which there are definitely smartwatches that characterize your HRV in deep sleep. And if you just even let a couple of artifacts through, you will, with HRV, you always exaggerate the variation. So the kind of the you will always make the HRV appear bigger than it really is. And in that case, that makes your system kind of less sensitive to, changes where stress is increasing, because where stress is increasing, heart rate variability is decreasing, because slightly counterintuitively, variation in beat to beat timing is normally indicative of a healthy, responsive cardiovascular system. And that in an evolutionary context is something that's really useful, because that allows the body to, adapt to the most energetically efficient state, no matter what it is that you're doing at the time. And a lot of that variation is then created and modulated by the vagus nerve, and that's the parasympathetic, the rest and digest system. So you don't want to, if you're trying to make a system that's sensitive to increasing load, increasing stresses of the different kinds of stress, then in general you don't want your HRV values to be exaggerated, and that certainly is something that can and does happen. So you want to be able to ensure you reject as many artifacts as possible, so you can reflect the true, often low level of HRV that you want to then take action over.
Yeah, because when I was doing it in the lab, I had to manually review every single one because I didn't
Yeah,
trust the noise,
yeah.
and we had the raw data, we had the RRs, so you had to sit there and stare at the EKG, look at the RRs, and then
Mm.
it was pretty clear when you would find ones like, what didn't fit. There wasn't really much of a discrepancy, but
Mm.
oh boy, that's not very exciting to do for hours on end.
No, it isn't. But that is what they used to do. So I mean,
Yeah.
the history of the HRV goes back to the Reverend Stephen Hales in the 18th century. It's about 1730 or so, that he was someone who did a lot of work on trying to understand the human circulation, cardiovascular system, and he noticed that the pulse got more rapid when people breathe in, which was a good observation, right? Because
Yeah.
that's kind of fundamental, really. So when you breathe in, what actually happens is that you create a negative pressure inside your chest. That's what makes the air flow in down your trachea into the lungs, because your diaphragm is contracting and decreasing the pressure in your chest. But that also increases what's known as venous return. So when that decreased pressure happens inside the chest cavity, it stimulates more blood to be returned to the atria of the heart, into the right atrium, and more blood coming in actually, it kind of necessitates that the heart beats faster, because you've got more blood coming in. So what's the heart going to do? Is it going to, back up for several seconds, or is it going to deal with it? And it deals with it by having sensors in the right atrium. So it senses this increased flow, slightly increased pressure, and says, okay, I need to beat faster. And that's how it responds to those pressure changes.
Is that then governed via direct connection to the SA node then? Is that how it's making the changes in, if I remember correctly?
Yeah, it is. It is. So you've got you've got stretch sensors basically on the junctions, in fact, of the vena cava, as they're known, into the right atrium. So it kind of senses that additional stress and that additional stretch, and that stimulates the heartbeat to increase. That's in a healthy cardiovascular system.
And that's why on the app, you went with what they call paced breathing. So if people haven't done the app, you're looking at it, you're breathing in and breathing out to a set timing,
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That was something
which was
that,
debatable at that time. There was a lot of literature I read because I was even debating, do I do that in my study or not? And there was arguments on both sides for doing it versus not doing it.
mm. Yeah, I'm still happy with the choice of providing a breathing pacer. I mean, you can ignore it if you want to. And I know that Dr. Andrew Flatt, in a lot of his studies, he was just looking for purely spontaneous breathing.
Sure.
Um, I think that if you've got a mechanism in the body which is dependent on breathing, I don't think nobody would argue that HRV doesn't depend on breathing rate and depth, right? Anybody
Yeah.
who studied the subject would agree to that. The question then becomes, are you going to create additional stress by making mental stress by making people follow an animation as opposed to just having them relax and do it all kind of smoothly? And what I've found is that people who are used to doing breathing exercises generally they don't have any problem with the breathing pacer, and it helps you just sort of, I mean, you're only asking people to do it for a minute, so hopefully there's not much chance of them hyperventilating. So we have a nice slow pace. And in fact, the pace I chose for the pacer came out of a study which looked at the mean breathing rate of a group of club standard runners, basically. And that breathing rate of about 7.5 breaths per minute is about half of that of the general population. And that shows you that athletic people, they have some really good adaptations, one of which is that, their oxygen exchange and their lung capacity are just much better than the average population. So they don't need to breathe at 15 breaths a minute. They breathe at seven or 8 breaths a minute.
Yeah, which is crazy low. Like, I mean, I've looked
Mm,
at,
it is, yeah.
got hundreds of data on Aura now through just my own practice and through doing work for rapid health optimization. And
Mm.
even on some of their high-end athletes, I think the lowest I've seen during sleep is 11, I think. Um,
Okay.
but it's wild how you'll see some, not always the case, but you will find these outliers who have a high VO2 max, are pretty well trained, and the
Mm.
respiratory rate at night is 16, 17, 18 breaths a
Mhm.
minute, which is pretty crazy.
Mm. That is, yeah, yeah, and perhaps not what you'd
Definitely
expect.
not what you want.
No, no, that's not what I expect. And 6 breaths per minute is a special rate in meditation, because at that rate you then synchronize the. I mean, it's kind of breathing is one of the very few mechanisms in the body which runs autonomously, but you can consciously override. So, you can choose your breathing rate, but 99% of the time you're not thinking about it at all, and it continues. So 6 breaths per minute is a special rate because that brings your breathing, the changes in blood pressure that occur because of this effect whereby you're changing your pressure inside the chest with breathing, that then coincides with a compensatory mechanism which is called the baroreflex. And the baroreflex in most people works at about 0.1 hertz, which is 6 breaths per minute. So what you can do then is you can actually deliberately create big peaks and troughs in your blood pressure at a rate of, once every 10 seconds, basically, for the peaks and troughs. And that is supposed to have a beneficial effect, not only just transiently, but over the longer term as well, to help relieve potential hypertension and sensations of anxiety as well. So it's a meditative breathing rate, and I think the reason why that works is because it accentuates these peaks and troughs and may act as a kind of reset to the
Hmm.
body's sensing systems, the baroreceptors, which are located in the neck, in the carotid arteries, and the aortic arch, and perhaps other parts of the system as well. But I'm sure you probably know more about that than I do. But
Yeah, and on that, what is your thoughts? If you have an even bias to inhale, exhale would be 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out.
mm,
Would you bias the exhale at that point
mm,
to try to bias more of the parasympathetic
mhm.
system, like a 4 second in, 6 second exhale, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, my friend and colleague Professor McConnell, who's who's done a lot of consulting work with on cardiorespiratory interactions. In any of the experiments I've done with her, she specifies an equal inhale,
Hmm.
exhale, and not really any pauses in between either. It's just sort of a constant
In and out.
in and out. Yeah. I've certainly read, I've seen it put down as an argument that you should extend the exhale because that will mean then that at the end of the exhalation you kind of have a lower heart rate and perhaps
Right.
that might bias the heart rate lower overall. But I haven't seen any experiments versus, equal inhale and exhale that conclusively make the case for that you end up with a lower mean heart rate at the end of the exercise.
Now, is that similar to what kind of the heart math people do with related to the coherence effect then, correct?
Yeah. That's what people refer to as coherence is when the deliberate sort of blood pressure waves that you're introducing with your paced breathing coincide then with the resonance of your baroreflex. And you can get some pretty big peaks and troughs in your blood pressure then. I don't remember the figures off the top of my head, but I would expect it to be more than 20 to 30 millimeters of mercury difference between the peaks and troughs.
Yeah,
So a bit.
and that kind of fits my general theory of what I just call HDR or human dynamic range. Like,
Mm.
what are things you can do to increase the range, the low end, the high end, and then kind of the variability in between, right? So if you can do something that's not, let's say, exercise related, obviously exercise can, massively push up the high end of blood pressure, but just by altering and playing with breathing, you can basically create a bigger range at rest, I think is probably going to be beneficial because a lot of people over time, whether it's temperature exposure, heart rate, sympathetic, parasympathetic, metabolic flexibility, carbohydrates, fats, like
Mm.
they just get kind of crushed on
Mm.
both ends of these systems. And when that happens, it looks like fine scale variability goes out the window, and then all these systems like just start falling apart.
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of helping them to reset their end stops rather than just letting them, you know, sort of fur up somewhere in the middle is quite helpful,
Yeah,
I think. Yeah.
very cool. And then
Mm.
if we fast forward to today, oh, the last part I was going to make too is that I think you were the first people to say you can get away with 60 seconds of data acquisition. Obviously, you published work on that, where I think even the Megawave people were doing at least 3 minutes or 5 minutes. Like a lot of the clinical measurements were, several
Mhm.
minutes or even longer. And
Mhm.
I thought that was like super cool because even with that, compliance is always going to be an issue when
Mm.
you're requiring someone to do a dedicated measurement. So if you
Yeah.
can get that measurement to be accurate and representation of what's going on in a shorter time frame,
Mm.
I thought that was super cool because a lot of the research stuff was like, well, we don't care because people are going to come into the lab and we're going to watch them for 5, 10 minutes, whatever.
Yeah.
But I think you understood that when you release it as a consumer device, most consumers are not going to sit there for 10 minutes every morning just to get a measurement.
No, no, no. No, they're not. So I always had a minute in mind as a target, but I was super happy, I will admit, when working with one of these physiologists at Essex University, Dr. Gavin Sandercock. He pointed me to research which showed that with the measure I was proposing, this RMSSD, which has subsequently become really, really popular, that we could certainly get by with 30 to 40 seconds of good quality data. So I thought if I make the measurement just under a minute, then even if there is some corrupted data in there, I can
Yeah.
still get 30 to 40 seconds of good stuff out of it.
Yeah, that's super cool. And why did you pick RMSSD, which my bias, and again, looking back in history, I would say that was the correct one. Obviously, I've been more biased towards these time
Mm.
domain ones,
Mm.
but what made you pick that measurement? Because even back then, like when I did my research, I ran it through Kubios. There's,
Mm.
you could pick time domain, frequency domain, there's nonlinear domains, there's all
Mm.
sorts of stuff. What made you kind of pick that one?
I think a couple of reasons. I did have a look at different metrics. I didn't think it was going to be practical in the capabilities of the phone at that time to do a frequency domain analysis,
Mm,
which was the other main option that I was looking at. Also, I think it might have been James Heathers pointed me to some of the controversies about the interpretation of in particular, the frequency domain ratios. People talked
yep.
about F divided by LF, and we don't really know what LF is. So why does dividing something that you might understand by
Yeah.
something isn't understood? Why does that produce a sensible
We get
result?
numbers though, so it must be cool.
Yeah. And I thought that was going to be a bit complicated to implement, and it would really require people to do the pace breathing as well. So I wanted to make the pace breathing, a useful prompt, but not mandatory. I also knew that SDNN, which was the first kind of medically deployed HRV
Hmm.
measure. That is the one that people you made reference to, sort of looking at ECG traces and sort of marking valid versus invalid beats. And what they did to calculate SDNN was they would simply use a ruler on the ECG trace, and they would measure the differences between the adjacent R wave peaks, and then they would simply calculate the standard deviation of all of the good ones. And that was the first HRV measure, and it was shown in research that that was a very sensitive indicator when people were brought into hospital with having had a heart attack. It was a very good independent prognostic indicator for how likely they were to survive the first 24 hours. I mean, it sounds rather dramatic, doesn't it? But HRV was used for that in the 1980s, I think, or maybe even a little bit earlier, maybe 1970s. So that was another candidate. But I wanted something that was more sensitive to the parasympathetic nervous system rather than the all-encompassing SDNN. And that meant that I had to be able to sense the changes that were induced by breathing. And RMSSD was in the literature as a way really of looking at the adjacent beat interval differences. And that essentially acts for us engineering types as a high pass filter. So that was going to separate
Mm.
out the respiratory component from the baroreflex and other very low frequency effects that you get from like thermoregulation and various other mechanisms that are going on the body. So RMSSD was the simplest calculation, which would actually quantify the effect I was looking for. I think that's probably the short answer. But
Yeah, and I think with the available computing power, it was relatively easy to do the math from a processor standpoint, correct?
it was, but the problem with RMSSD as a raw measure is that it has some good properties, as we just mentioned. It's able to separate out the effects of the parasympathetic nervous system and breathing, but it's not a good measure because in human beings it's highly asymmetrical. So it's what you call a positively skewed distribution. So if the population mean for RMSSD is about, I can't remember what it is, 25 or 27 milliseconds, something like that, then you haven't got far to go in the negative direction before you kind of get close to zero. If you get below 10, then that's not a healthy system by any, that's not a
Yeah.
healthy cardiovascular system, right? But on the high end to Ironman triathletes, you can get 150 or even 200. So you've got a really big asymmetry in the distribution. So you've got lots of variation on the positive side and rather little variation on the negative side. So the thing to do then is to start with the natural log and see if you get a more symmetrical distribution, which we did, and that was great. But then you end up with a scale that's not very intuitively interpretable. So you get something that will like go from, I don't know, 2.5 to 4.8 or something like that. And you think for a consumer product, that's
Good luck
that's
with all
not going to cut it. That's just
that.
not exciting as a consumer scale, is it? So let's multiply it by 20. Okay, so we multiply it by 20, and that then gave an intuitively interpretable scale, which went from like below 50 on the low end. So I had a boys' curry night recently with some cyclists that I've known for a long time, and a couple of them we were reminiscing over early days of iThlete HRV measures, and both of them, in fact, had had really bad flus. This predated
Mm.
COVID, so they'd had like swine flu, one of them, and another one had really other bad flu. And they would normally have an iThlete measurement of 80, 85. They were quite aerobically healthy guys. And they went down to like in the 30s
Oof.
one morning. And they said they knew just from that HRV measurement that they were getting quite sick. And in one case, one of them was in hospital within a few hours after that,
Oof.
got so sick. So the intuitive interpretability of the scale was really important. So a lot of people are in the like 60s, 70s, maybe low 80s or so if you're quite athletic, quite aerobically fit. We certainly have seen values of 100, and some people think there's a hard stop at 100 on the iThlete scale. There isn't. It can go over that. I think the highest ever was something like 112, and that
Oof.
was an Aboriginal Aussie rules professional football player. So
Wow.
never seen one higher than that. And on the low side, like I say, people who are really quite sick will be in the 30s. And I remember I did a couple of consumer electronics shows actually at in Las Vegas. We had a stand there, and I had a journalist come over who wanted to write about iFleet. And I think this was, I don't know, maybe 2014, something like that. And he was quite overweight, and he had diabetes, and he took his measurement and it was like 38. And he just, without me telling him about the scale, he immediately started apologizing about his lifestyle. And I thought, okay, well, this scale works, right? This guy that he needs to do something about this health condition. Yeah, so anyway, so that's where the 20 times the natural log of RMSSD came from. And I was pretty happy about that also for another reason, and that's because one unit was basically 5%, a 5% change, and that was about I don't know whether smallest worthwhile change is a concept that's worth talking
Yeah.
about in too much depth, but it's quite often used in sports science. So, we didn't need to go to decimal points, and 1 point, was worth, worth some kind of appreciation.
Yeah. And I thought that was actually extremely useful because when I was doing research, trying to explain HRV to people was a freaking nightmare because
Mm,
the concept was new, so they didn't really quite grasp the concept. And then it was, if someone did know about it, it's like, oh, well, what measurement did you do? Now the scales are
mm,
different. Now the numbers actually mean something different. Now there's the argument about, like, James Heathers and those guys about frequency domain and what does it actually really measure? Is it really useful? And it seemed like the rush was to get all these measurements into an app. And some of the other ones I looked at had good intentions, but in terms of useful to consumers who are not hardcore researchers, I kept testing out a bunch of them, and all they did
mm,
was drive me batshit crazy. Because even if they were valid, now I had to explain to a customer of, well, okay, so your time domain actually changed a little bit here, but the high frequency domain didn't move as much as the low frequency domain, and it was just a nightmare. It was so nice to have one
mm,
number that was relatively intuitive. Okay, when your number is higher, you're more parasympathetic. When your number is lower, you're more sympathetic. And that was nice to, and then also have the qualitative indicators on there and
mm,
nothing else. Like that
mm.
was to me, and still is, the best for someone actually having to use the device with people who are not HRV experts. I don't expect my athletes to be HRV experts when they're doing it.
No, and that was always the aim from my point of view, was to have something, a tool that was easy to use, easy to interpret, hopefully easy for coaches to use as well. We did a team system and we did a coach system, and it was popular with team sports for a while. But yeah, I mean, there's so many sort of politics and dynamics in professional team
Oh yeah.
sport that an HRV reading, isn't going to be used in practice to make many decisions, unfortunately. So it is useful, but it's not going to be as acted on as if an individual athlete, a pro athlete, or amateurs are using it. And we've had plenty of people use it for wellness and recovery from conditions, as well as athletes training. My initial interest was from the point of view of trying to improve my own training, and I've always had the tendency to want to train with people who are better than me, which is good on one level. But if you do the same volume and intensity who are better than you, then there's only one certain outcome from
Yeah.
that. You're going to get sick or injured. Yeah, so I kind of HRV was my tool that told me when to back off.
And then if we fast forward to today,
Hmm.
is the HRV app still being supported? Like, what is kind of the status of where we're at right now?
Yeah, so the HRV app is still available on the app stores for sort of a couple of different reasons, really. I've decided to close down the web service, iFleet Pro. One of them was that the hosting was getting super expensive and costly to maintain as well. We needed to do a major database upgrade, which was going to cost a lot of money. So that was one reason. Another reason was that I've got a bigger yeah, I've got a day job now, which is 4 solid days a week, which perhaps we'll come on to in a
Yeah.
moment. And the third one was that I had a bit of a, well, a sort of significant health scare, really. I got diagnosed at the end of 2023 with prostate cancer, which was starting to spread, which is, that's a bit scary.
Mm.
And I ended up having robotic surgery in January last year. So we're coming up to the
Oh,
anniversary
wow.
of that. And I cannot sing the praises of the Southampton University Hospital urology department loudly enough. They've been absolutely amazing the whole way through. But the symptoms that I had for it were really quite mild, Mike.
Hmm.
So I was feeling a bit more tired than usual. And my partner, Julie, noticed that I was eating more than usual, but not exercising more than usual and losing about a kilo a month. So that
Oh,
kind
wow.
of, that little constellation of my HRV wasn't down in the dumps, but it wasn't kind of at its normal level. But I thought there could be several reasons for that. So it was, HRV is sensitive but not specific, I suppose.
Right.
I went to the GP, had the a small battery of immune tests, which came back absolutely fine, other blood tests fine. And then she sort of called me up and said, you're nearly 60. We better give you a PSA test just to be sure. So I had a PSA test, and sure enough, that was like 2 or 3 times what it's supposed to be.
Hmm.
So that, yeah, but recovery, I'm just going to show this on the screen. So this is a year's worth of data just on the screen there. I don't know whether that's
Oh, yeah. Well, it looks like it's definitely gone up over time.
it has gone up over time. So yeah, I mean that's charted my recovery in HRV. And I have to say that I would say how I feel and how energetic I am has corresponded pretty well with that upward curve. So yeah, so that's good, but nowadays I'm the chief scientist for a company called Zim, which has been developing a product called Lifelight, which the aim of it, and we're pretty close to realizing it now, is to be able to measure blood pressure and heart rate by just having you look at the camera on a phone or a tablet for 40 seconds. So
Hmm.
this does use the similar principles to what I first explored with the finger sensor, which is known as PPG, photoplethysmography. But this uses remote PPG, so it actually senses a phenomenon that we sometimes refer to as micro blushing. So although we can't see it when we're looking at each other now, the blood flow in our cheeks is also, in the capillaries in our skin everywhere, and in the cheeks in particular, is being modulated by the heart rate. And not only can we measure heart rate from that, but we can also look at the morphology and HRV and other things of that, and we can then use AI tools to estimate and predict somebody's blood pressure. So we're on the verge of having that certified as a class 2 medical device. So that's quite exciting. So I'm giving a lot of my time and energy to running the science for that. And we've done a load of clinical studies. Um, and yeah, continuing to do more specialized studies with it. In fact, we were just starting one in a neonatal ICU. We're starting to do one with patients with atrial fibrillation as well to help them sort of better understand their condition.
Are
So
you
yeah,
able to pick
it's,
HRV off of that then? Also, it sounds like you said.
yeah. So I mean, you've got some more technical challenges to doing it.
Yeah.
The signal is much weaker than you get from a dedicated sensor, but we've a lot of our work has been on signal processing to clean up the signal, and we've found all kinds of ways to clean it up and make it look like a nice pulse. So and to have the properties of the pulse. One of the good things about sensing signals on the cheek is that it's directed fairly closely to the output of the heart, to the aorta. So you're sort of sensing without too much distance, and obviously without putting needles and catheters and cannulas inside people. You're kind of sensing their central blood pressure waveform, which is the best place to sense it. It's better than the arm or the wrist. It's kind of a purer version of what's going on.
And I would imagine there's other applications for that in terms of, I don't know, the one place my brain goes to is I just think about all the Zoom conferences and everything like that, or even
Mm.
just if I'm doing an assessment on an athlete remotely, like
Mm.
maybe in the future there'll be everyone will have their little biometric below their thing that shows changing heart rate and HRV and stuff like that. I
Mm.
don't know.
Well, yeah, that is possible. That is definitely possible. I mean, our applications are initially, population health screening in particular to help identify undiagnosed hypertension. Because, hypertension is often referred to as the silent killer because you won't necessarily get symptoms until something pops, and you definitely don't want that to happen. And also to helping people to track their blood pressure at home. So, to help reinforce good behavior patterns, whether that's taking the medication on time or whether it's exercise, reducing alcohol, the other kind of things that we hope people will do by measuring their HRV frequently is also true of their blood pressure. So yeah, life flights are useful. Hopefully going to be used in lots of places on lots of phones.
Very cool. And it's any
Mm.
camera can grab that data, right? So you say computer, phone, anything that you've got a high quality camera.
It can. You need to have good low-level control over the camera. So at the moment, that's using the full APIs, programming interfaces that are available in iOS for Apple devices and Android as well, the camera control APIs, because we need to be able to control the frame rate and make sure that that's accurate, because that determines all of our sampling intervals for which we
Sure.
kind of, can construct the waveform afterwards. Also, exposure is very important. So, a lot of the time, selfie cameras are, continuously adjusting for the best aesthetic effect, and that's not necessarily what you want from a sensor. That they'll
Hmm.
be adjusting to, give an exposure which looks, makes your skin look smooth and the
Huh.
right color and healthy and things. So there's lots of increasing amounts of aesthetic image enhancement software that go into cameras. So you've got to make sure you get the signal out before those have had a chance to distort it in a way that's not helpful when you want when you just want to sense what's going on.
Is that true of all cameras now? I was talking to my tattoo artist, and he was saying when he was trying to take photos of certain things that a lot of the new phones now are just auto-correcting or trying to run autocorrect on everything just as the norm in the background now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And the more you pay for your phone, then the more of that
The
software
more you
expected,
get.
isn't it? That's more you get, yeah. Which makes you look great on Insta, but yeah.
That's kind of wild. And it's so funny that it's like until I talked to him about it, even having this conversation with you, like I would have never thought of that. And the fact that it's kind of done for you running in the background. I don't know if a lot of people would know that. And like, I don't know. It's kind of creepy to me.
Yeah, but you do kind of know, or you do find out if you're not naturally a good photographer when you start using like a little digital SLR camera that doesn't have all of this image
Oh,
compensation
sure.
stuff. You think you're going to take better pictures with it than your phone. Well, that's not necessarily the case. When you look at, yeah, you're going to find you've overexposed some areas and then you've underexposed others. And in fact, for most people, most of the time, the image processing software in the phone is what allows them to get good pictures.
Mm.
And you have to work pretty hard with a camera that doesn't have that software in it to get good effects.
And having a health scare like that, I assume it made you kind of reevaluate some different things. Like, do you mind sharing like that process?
Yeah, I mean it's quite scary initially, no doubt about it. It's certainly and me getting diagnosed with that made my brother immediately go to his GP and get a test, and sure enough, he had a high PSA level too.
Mm,
He actually chose a slightly different treatment route. He went with radiotherapy, which I don't think it was really an option for me. Everybody was
mm.
saying, you're healthy, you're fit, go for the surgery option. And historically, prostate cancer surgery has been a pretty scary thing, right? Back in the 1970s,
Yeah.
80s, I think the 50% survival time was about 5 years or so,
Oh,
following
wow. Oof.
surgery. Yeah. And now with robotic surgery, I mean, it's incredible. I can't help it as somebody who's interested in medical engineering, just admiring the process and how much that is advanced. And you just have I think it's about five or six, small holes in the abdomen, all of which have like complete, you can't even find them now for the various arms of the
Yeah.
robot.
Laparoscopic. Yeah.
Yeah, laparoscopic tools, and they do all of their stuff inside, and recovery is quite quick, really. Well, it's quite quick for, I would say, for the initial wounds and things like that. But there are side effects from that kind of surgery, and they can take weeks and months for you to get over. And your whole system has been disturbed, and I think that's why we kind of see that HRV was sort of bumped down a few weeks after surgery, and then since May last year, so that was effectively 3 to 4 months after surgery. It's just kind of kicked up, and the whole time since. But I was certainly worried that I would never be able to get back on a bike again. I'd never
Mm.
be able to sit on a bicycle saddle again, and that it's that's been fine. I read lots of online articles from people who were keen cyclists who'd had this kind of surgery. Does it cause you to reevaluate? I think it does, obviously, that you think, you've had a condition, and with, the recent diagnosis of Chris Hoy, the Olympic cyclist, he had stage 4 prostate cancer. I was only like one half a level below that, but his had already
Oh,
spread
wow.
to the bones. And you think, well, that's lucky. So I definitely have, Julie to thank for making me go along to the primary care practice and get some tests done, because if I'd left it another few months, it could have been worse. So that's an advice for all those men out there who are perhaps in their late 40s, early 50s. If you've got any history of prostate cancer in the family, then do get a PSA test done, because you know you definitely, it is something that can grow and linger inside you without you having any strong symptoms. You may not realize that you've got it, and then once it starts spreading to the bones and the bowels and other places, then it can't be cured at that point, can only be managed. So I just feel really grateful for great care. Yeah, I mean, both people close to me and people, who'd never met me before in the urology department, but always caring, and quite often with some good little dose of humor thrown in. But
Oh,
yeah.
that's good. Yeah, for a while I started looking at blood work on clients like many, many years ago in the past, and then I kind of stopped, in all honesty, because I wasn't really sure what I was looking at, and I was like, it's kind of a legal liability. I'm not trying to replace their doctor. I'm just using it for performance stuff.
Mm,
And then starting probably like 5 or 6 years ago, I started doing it again because I realized this is usually more men than women, but sometimes women too. I
mm,
would ask guys, I'm like, okay, you're, 47 now. When's the last time you just had a basic blood panel? And most of the time, although it has gotten better lately, they have no idea. Like, if you can't remember, it's been way too long.
mm,
And you're like, okay, go to your doc, whatever. And it's like, do you even know who your doctor is? No, I have no idea.
mm,
It's like, ah.
mm,
So that even if I can just get them to do something, even if it's through a direct lab thing, they can run it on their own. At least if there is something wacky, then we have data to be like, yes, you definitely need to go to your physician like
mm,
now, because, there's not something I'm going to help you with. There's something you need a physician to deal with. But it's crazy how even just basic stuff like that, just still even now is, I think, very underappreciated and not done.
mm, mm. Yeah, I mean, get some objective data. because your body may not be giving you enough feedback for you to identify that. Thinking back on it though, I did have some unexplained kind of poor, I don't know, what's poor endurance performance. So I've always
Hmm.
regarded myself as an endurance athlete, somebody who can like do these semi-competitive cycle rides around like the island of Mallorca, 300, 200 miles, do that in a
Oh,
day.
wow.
Great. And I'd done that several times. And I'd done the what's called the Étape du Tour, which is the stage of the Tour de France that amateurs can do. And it's all kind of organized. It's about 10,000 enthusiastic amateurs do usually one of the most challenging stages of the Tour de France for that year. And I did that in 2023 in the summer. And it was up to a kind of resort called Morzine in the Alps. And I remember it was a hot day. It was like 41 degrees centigrade. I don't know what that is
Oof.
in Fahrenheit anymore. It's like
It's
100.
hot.
It was hot, properly hot. And there were like people sitting by the side of the road with their heads in their hands because just, they were early stages of heat exhaustion. um,
Yeah.
and I made it to the top of the resort, but I got tunnel vision, and luckily when I got to the top of the last climb, one of the helpers, or one of the race kind of helpers, said to me, in French, which luckily I can speak. She said, "Don't cycle down yet. Please give yourself 10 minutes. Have a sit down
Hmm.
before you go down to the finish line." And that's hard advice to take, but I knew somehow she was right. I lay down on the
Hmm.
ground and I was just out. I was asleep for about 15 minutes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I mean, from lying down, I just went out like a light. And then I woke up 15 minutes later, and everything sort of came back into focus. I got back on the bike, went down, did the descent, which was quite a dangerous descent, and it was very hot. And I was very glad I'd done that. But I thought afterwards that performance was not, I couldn't really explain why I had felt so tired. And I spoke later to the urology specialist, and they said the stage of tumor that I had been growing for a long time. So was probably already taking a toll on my system when I was doing that. So sort of unexplained underperformance, I think, would be the coaching term for it.
Yeah, and
But
those are always so hard to figure out, even on yourself,
yeah.
because you look at I mean, I've had this happen multiple times, and even kind of now, I'm thinking like, yeah, do I need to zap my scars or something weird going on? Because like training performance is pretty good, sleep is good, nutrition's pretty good, but my HRV is still much lower than what it normally is. So then you always wonder, okay, is it work stress? Is it additional
Mm,
things? And it's always hard to even pin down what's actually going on too.
mm. Well, I mean, one of the consistent sort of benefits, I think, of people using iThlete and probably other HRV apps and wearables as well, is that even if you think that you're a pretty dedicated sports person or athlete, the biggest source of stress is your daily, like, life stress from work, from
Hmm.
mental stress, financial, emotional worries. That is the stuff that really dominates a lot of people's, HRV and their ability to recover as well, because your body sort of sums up all of the stresses together. So it kind of adds up the effects of the mental stress, chemical stress, and training stress. And what you experience, what you see via your HRV is the consequence of all of those stresses added together. And although you think you might work pretty hard in a workout, that doesn't normally dominate your average stress. That's really dominated by mental, emotional, work stress.
Yeah, that's my my sort of goal if I was only doing performance and, didn't have to work, didn't have a job, other stuff, whatever, or could, reduce some of that stuff is to actually have training be like the number one stressor that changes my HRV. Because like if that's one of my red
Yeah.
flags with an athlete of if we just, pound your nose into the ground multiple days and your HRV isn't changing much and it was already kind of on the lower side to begin with, okay, that's telling me something's going on in your outside life that's very stressful. Even if your nutrition is good, even if your sleep is good, like there's something else going on there where the athletes who have that more intact, like you can definitely see how their training and stress is directly changing their HRV, which to me is a good thing because one, that's more controllable. Two, we can adjust that, and three, that's telling me your outside life in terms of stress level is pretty good. Like that's a good thing.
Yeah, yeah. But I think that's a luxury for the minority of athletes
Oh,
that
100%.
training stress dominates their HRV. Yeah.
Yeah, when I first started looking at it, I thought, oh, if they're a professional athlete, then, it's their training stress is always going to be the number one thing. And in some cases, that's true, right? They don't have anything else to do, air quotes. But in some cases, it was almost worse. If they've got contract obligations, they've got, other things they have to do, they've got multiple day practices, maybe they're in season, and you then realize that, oh wow, like this may be their only job, but it has so many other subcomponents
Hmm.
that are still pulling at them, even though they're a professional athlete and don't have to go to a, air quotes like day job.
Yeah. Yeah, and they've got pressures to perform as well, haven't they?
Yeah.
It's not a happy position often being a professional sports person. It's a limited duration of career and you want to make the most of it. So yeah.
And last question as we wrap up. I get this question a lot, so I'm super curious on what your thoughts are. What would be your top four things for someone who comes to you that says, "Hey, I'm bought into HRV. I like using the device. I measure it each morning. We're doing all the good, ways to measure it. Well, my HRV is still kind of low." What would be like your top four things to increase your HRV?
Hmm. Yeah, I think there's a few things which are fairly well proven to help here. And probably the number one is like, I mean, not only sleep duration, but sleep hygiene, sleep quality. So,
Mm-hmm.
try to get solid, restful sleep. Try to avoid the temptation of that extra beer or extra glass of wine close to bedtime, because although you may get to sleep more quickly, it will definitely interfere. And one of the comments I've most frequently had over the years back is, I didn't realize until now, how much, that would impact my recovery, having that extra glass before
Yeah.
bedtime. So that'd be
And I've
one.
even seen the type of alcohol. Obviously, the dose matters, but I've even seen the type of alcohol make a difference too, which is crazy.
Mm. Yeah, I can certainly imagine that. Another one would be, well, breathing. So deep breathing, I think, is very helpful. And I was amazed when I first did, this is going back quite a few years, when I first did my own little coherence app, which basically sensed the changes which were happening in HRV due to the baroreflex in my body, and then it generated the breathing stimulus from that. So it sensed the direction of the change and created basically made the animation move either in or out to make my breathing quickly augment that pattern. And I was really surprised at how much my HRV jumped up from doing that. And it wasn't a temporary thing. It was like
Hmm.
something that was kind of locked in for the long term. So that was good. And it might have, what we discussed earlier about, sort of pressure sensor resetting mechanism, that might have been, what was going on there. Um,
Is
Another
that
one.
app available? Because I know everyone's going to ask.
Yeah, no, it's not. I never made it. I never made it commercially available. No, I didn't. So no. I don't know. I might dig it out sometime, rebuild it. I think it's probably, I'm sure it's expired, but it could be a useful thing. Yeah. I think cold water immersion is something
Hmm.
that I'm quite fond of, and I think it's really quite therapeutic, not only for your HRV but for your immune system as well. There's some really nice data on how just even simple things like turning your shower to fully cold at the end of your
Mm-hmm.
shower, it makes you sort of zing with energy, and my experience, that helps boost your HRV as well. And I guess there's probably a lot around mental health, meditation, not beating yourself up too much, spending time with friends, all of those ways which help to relieve the buildup of daily mental and emotional stress, which we were just discussing, tends to dominate. So whatever works for you in terms of making you feel good, making you feel happy, that is gonna reflect in your HRV as well.
Awesome. Any other tidbits of HRV. My last question I had is there anything really you think is kind of out there or things you suspect may be true, but we just don't have any research on it yet since you've been in the HRV space now for, decade and a half, longer than that when you first started, coming up on 2 decades.
Hmm. So something I've been intrigued by for a long time, at least one of those decades, is whether or not by measuring the change in HRV during exercise, we can accurately detect people's thresholds. So their respiratory threshold, their lactate threshold. There is some evidence to support that, but there's not, the studies haven't been done on enough people and precisely enough to then be able to say that we can definitely measure. And if you're an endurance athlete, you want to know those thresholds very precisely. And the only way that you can really get that done is by going to a proper sports performance evaluation lab and sitting on an ergometer or running on a treadmill and looking at your respiratory
Yeah.
quotient.
Metabolic heart data.
Yeah, no, yeah, metabolic cart data. I'd like to think that by using, a good quality chest strap and looking at HRV, and I don't know what measures would tell us that exactly, it would be whether it be detrended fluctuation analysis, something to do with, a reduction in entropy, maybe just simple a calibration of threshold values of RMSSD. I've seen evidence that all of those can be used, but they're not currently, thought of as being precise enough to replace metabolic cart testing.
Yeah, my thoughts on that would be if someone's listening and they want to contact us, like having a non-invasive with zone 2 being all the rage now, and my
Yeah.
guess from I'm not completely up to date on that literature, but from looking at it briefly, I
Mm,
think that may be the easier one to detect out of all the zones. And just having a zone 2 detector where you
mm,
just have your heart rate strap on, you've got maybe another little app, a little like a temperature gauge that fluctuates up and down that says when you've crossed it or when you're getting close
mm.
to it. Because we know that that can change also on a day by day basis. You're
Yeah.
probably not going to go all out Peter Attia and, prick your finger for lactate all the time, which
Mm,
definitely useful, but most people are probably not going to do that. You're not going to be a weirdo like me and buy your own friggin' metabolic cart to do your own testing, but just a non-invasive way of doing that and have that measurement give you feedback while
mm,
you're doing it, I think would be super useful.
mm. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And seeing that progress over time with your training can help to reinforce the good discipline that's required to do the zone 2 training efficiently.
Yeah, and it
You
could
shouldn't
just give
really
you
go over
simple.
the line, right? I mean, you need to do lots of volume just below the line.
Yep, and I think it would just give you simple metrics of percentage of time, in zone 2, percentage you went over, your total
Mm,
duration in the zone, and then, your average heart rate in the zone over time, right?
mm,
So now you can confirm you were doing true zone 2 training, 95% of the time. Ooh, my average heart rate before for 60 minutes was 117 beats per minute. Now 8 weeks later, it's 113 beats per minute or whatever, right? You can,
mm,
because I think that's the hard part with zone 2 is that, yeah, you can look at power output and stuff like that, but most people don't have a lot of those complex metrics on their bike. So now you can take very simple stuff and see progress actually
mm.
over time, which I think is always the hardest for like the zone 2 work.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. But it's a really good investment in your body. I think one of the reasons why I recovered quite well after surgery is that I'd just done so many hours of zone 2 in the bank, and that hopefully gives you some good metabolic efficiency and flexibility, and that can serve you well when you need it later on.
Yeah. Now, last question that you brought up zone 2 real quick is, do you think you should do zone 2 stuff fasted? And if someone, let's say, argue is really in zone 2, what about duration? Like, what are your thoughts on duration they should be trying to hit per week?
Hmm. Well, I asked a question pretty similar to that at the Science and Cycling Conference, which a lot of the top coaches go
Oh,
to.
yeah.
Yeah, the couple of days before the actual Tour de France.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
And that was in the time when, sort of keto exercise was being talked about a lot. And
Mm.
and I basically, asked that a similar question. And I got shot down rather heavily.
Really?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Why?
The Well, they thought it really didn't make much sense to do zone two training fasted. But I suspect that that was in the context of high training volumes and wanting to ensure that the athletes can do those. I mean, it's like in Chris Froome's case was like 6 to 8 hours of zone two training day after day, right?
Yeah, because all those high-level cyclists are psychos.
They are. They
They
are.
are.
They are. They are. So yeah, don't know. It's certainly something that I've done a bit of. I know that if I go out fasted in the morning, doesn't matter what I've eaten the night before, that at pretty much exactly 90 minutes, my performance will fall off a cliff. So
Yeah,
that's and that hasn't changed much over the years, to be honest.
interesting.
Yeah. But I don't know what are your thoughts?
The short answer is I really want to see a study done because a lot of the data, from like Sanago Milan, who's done a lot of awesome work. Like I love his stuff. He was testing that shit. I used to send people to have metabolic flexibility testing in his lab freaking
Mm,
12 years ago. He's the only person who was like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea and was actually testing
mm,
people. But
mm,
so I love all this stuff, but a lot of, I think there's an over interpretation of zone two data from high end cyclists. And
mm,
is it beneficial in that population? I think, of course, it is. But I want to see a study in high end cyclists where maybe they did only 6 hours of zone two and one other group did 2 hours of zone two. Was there any difference? Because working with high level cyclists, the only way to get them to not do high intensity stuff is to tell them to do zone two stuff. Because
mm,
left to their own devices, like all they're just going to err on the high end all the time, at least in my limited experience. So by having them do zone two, you're actually titrating down the amount of high intensity work they can do on purpose. And I'd love to see that compared to, bro, just go for a walk or something, which again, high end
mm,
cyclists are never going to do this study. I don't even know if it'll ever get done. But
mm,
my guess is the high numbers of hours zone two is done in that group is beneficial because they're not doing high intensity stuff. Now, if you take
mm,
someone who's not very well trained, their VO2 max is barely 30,
mm,
telling them to do 3 hours or 4 hours of zone two, I think there's benefit to it, but I don't know if that's the best starting point because there's such poor leverage. I think
yeah.
if you've hit a plateau and you're in the middle, your
Mm,
VO2 max is maybe high 40s, low 50s,
mm,
you've done all the intelligent training and you can't get past a certain point, then yes, I have had those people go back, do 2, 3 hours of zone two stuff, do it fasted, do it for 8 hours religiously. Now we'll start adding back VO2 max work and high intensity stuff. And
mm.
then they seem to be able to handle that volume better. I don't
Mm.
know. That's my bias right now.
Yeah, no, that sounds sensible to me. And I think for time crunched athletes that want to do some zone two, but they also want to get some intensity in, I think it was Inigo San Milan that said, if you're doing like an hour and a half workout, then do, the first, 80 minutes or so,
Mm-hmm.
well controlled in zone two, then really go for it the last 10 minutes of the ride. You can still like, you can pack something of higher intensity in right at the end. I've also got a friend that I rode with last weekend who'd recently been on a training camp with pro cyclists, and he said he was amazed at just how polarized the training regime they'd been
Oh yeah.
undertaking was. It was hours and hours of zone two, and then they'd do like 6 30-second sprints, all out sprints at an incredibly high intensity, like 1,000 watts or so. They
Yeah,
were,
just insane output.
yeah, but for very short periods of time, very, very, and very well controlled.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's good. I don't know. Because I always get lots of hate mail about zone two, yay or nay. It just seems like the group that's saying they need more zone two training, at least in the fitness world, from my biased opinion,
Mm,
is the group that I probably would not have do zone two training. The group that's already doing it, the high end athletes, they've already been doing it. They've been doing it for tons of years.
mm.
It's just such a hard sell to get someone who's not doing any aerobic training to be like, bro, I want you on a bike for 3 hours this week. They're like, screw you. What are you talking about? And again, if their VO2 max is like 30, I
Mm,
just don't think that's the best use of their time to start. I don't think it's bad. I just think that's a really hard sell because you don't really see a big output at the end of that 8 weeks either.
And
And
you're going
that's
to
a
be going
mistake
really
I made.
slowly as well. You're not going to, it's not going to be a very exciting journey if you're, if you're
Oh no.
zone two, if you've only got like 30 mils per kilogram per minute. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, where can people find out more about you if you want to be found, and tell us about the new company and everything else?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm on LinkedIn, Simon Wegerif on LinkedIn, and the iFleet website is still up as well. So if anybody wants to email me directly, it's simon@myiFleet.com. So yeah, look forward to that. I've
Awesome.
really enjoyed catching up. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on here. And thank you so much for, all your work over the years, and especially for developing the app because I mean, being able to measure HRV daily with clients, especially starting back 14 years ago, that was
Mm.
a huge game changer. Because when doing it in the lab within that short period of time, I didn't foresee that we would be able to do it at home at a reasonable cost. I mean, there were some other systems like a Megawave who did a good
Mm.
job, but
Yeah.
the cost was just out of range for, 99% of people. So to have it be inexpensive and something they can do at home in a short period of time and accurate, that was like actually a true game changer, which I know that phrase gets overused, but that actually was.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm pretty happy with what we did. Didn't get mega rich out of it, but hopefully helped a few people to understand their bodies a bit better.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right. Cheers, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast here. I really appreciate it. A big thanks to Simon for all the support over many, many years, being the first person to put out an app for heart rate variability that I've been using with my private online clients literally for 14 years straight. I do some work with heart rate variability, a little bit with the guys over at Rapid Health Optimization, primarily using Aura for that, and also primarily looking at sleep. I do sleep analysis on all of the clients that come through their way. And yeah, so huge thanks to Simon. Hope you enjoyed the discussion. If you want more super geeky information, make sure to sign up to my daily newsletter, which is free. You can go to the link down below here, and you'll be able to get on it and just say hi. Well, I'll send you a free gift also if you do that. Just hit reply once you're on there. And then we've got the heart rate variability education course. We'll put a link to that down below if you really want to take a deep dive on heart rate variability without having to go back to get an engineering or a mathematics degree. No need necessary. And then when you're in the course, you can actually email me if you have any particular questions. More than happy to help you out there. And if you're looking for other things to test, check out my friends at LMNT for electrolytes, and then also Tecton for ketone esters that are tasty. So thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Really, really appreciate it. And as always, if you find someone who may enjoy this podcast, please forward it to them. And appreciate all of you. Hit the link, subscribe, download, all that kind of cool stuff to help the old algorithms. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Talk to all of you next week.
I wish they had done that differently. How would you want them to do it? Better?
This podcast is for informational purposes only. The podcast is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. You should not use the information on the podcast for diagnosing or treating a health problem or disease or prescribing any medication or other treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider before taking any medication or nutritional supplement, and with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this or any other podcast. Reliance on the podcast is solely at your own risk. Information provided on the podcast does not create a doctor-patient relationship between you and any of the health professionals affiliated with our podcast. Information and statements regarding dietary supplements are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to therein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.